LVT flooring is easy to lay with a few pro tips and tricks. I'll show you the complete process how to lay LVT, and I'll show you some of the trickier parts of the process, such as undercutting door frames, how to fit LVT around obstacles like radiator pipes, and fitting door bars. And that way you'll be able to get a professional look and finish yourself every single time. Now the very first thing that we do before we lay any LVT is prep the surface. So you can either use a brush or a vacuum cleaner and make sure the surface is nice and clean. So the surface is clean. One of the most important things when you're laying LVT is that the surface is actually nice and level and that there's no lumps and bumps in it, because LVT shows discrepancies in floors really badly. You can't hide it with LVT and it will show. Now if your existing floor is not nice and level, use self-level and compound to get it perfectly level before you put LVT down. If you want to learn how to do that, I'll pop a link to self-level and compound so you can see how I did this in the description and you can watch it after this video. Now the next important step is this stuff, Underlay. Have a look when you buy your flooring for the recommended Underlay. They'll tell you what they're suitable for. This one is Quick Step Vinyl Comfort. So we're going with the Quick Step. Now all you got to do at this stage is roll the underlay out roughly. I'm just going to roll out this one full length and then we'll cut around the pipes and any obstacles. To get complete coverage, we need to push the underlay to the wall. All I'm going to do is make a small cut just where that pipe is. Doesn't need to be hugely accurate at this stage. And now we can just shift that underlay over. So you can see we've cut around the pipes. All we've got to do is just take out that little bit of excess just close to the pipe there, just so the underlay sits nice and flat to the floor. And now we can't roll this any further because we're going to hit the staircase there, so we need to cut it around the staircase. In tricky rooms like this, there's always going to be things in the way, and that's why I chose to show you the LVT job in a tricky room, because it's easy to do this stuff in a square room. You wouldn't have any of these obstacles in completely square rooms. So what we're going to do in this case, we're going to pull a length of this off and we're just going to walk it in. So push your underlay in tight, and all you want to do is make a small cut in towards the obstacle, and we can push that round, make that a little bigger, push that round like that, and then fold that crease in and just cut along that obstacle. One little trick, use the back of your knife to create a crease, and then we can just follow that in. I'll run that all the way to the door and then I'll just make a cut in the doorway there. Of course, if you haven't got all these doorways, you're just going to be cutting around walls, and it's nice and simple. So to get rid of this overlap, I'm going to cut the length and push the whole thing that way, and then I'm going to trim that wall and put the excess piece into the door. So this piece here will carry on through into the door because we need this piece here, and then we won't have that much left to cut off. And you can see we'll butt the two pieces together, create a little crease in there, and we'll just cut off the excess. So that's the Quick Step Underlay down. You can tape the joint if you want to. Sometimes I do on big rooms, but I've just weighed this down at the ends so it doesn't curl up again for now. Once we get the floor down, the weight of the floating floor, because remember this LVT is a floating floor, the weight of that floating floor will sit on top of it and it won't go anywhere. Now it's worth knowing that a lot of LVTs these days, the more expensive ones at least, come with a underlay attached to the bottom of the plank itself, so you won't need to do this step. Now we've acclimatized the boxes of LVT to the room for a few days, bring them in a few days before and let them acclimatize. Now what we're going to do is look at how we set these out to get the perfect pattern throughout the room, so that we don't get any horrible little slivers of cuts at the ends or along the edges, because there's nothing worse than laying all your floor, getting to the last bit, and then there's a horrible little sliver of a cut along the edge. So I'm just going to get a bunch of these out and show you how I set out for LVT. When we lay LVT, we always start in the left-hand corner of the room. Now if we look at the plank, you can see we've got the receiving tongue, the bigger tongue, on two of the edges. The other edges have the small tongue, and we lay our boards away from that edge. So that big edge is going to receive the next board. That then lays in this direction from the left-hand corner, so we're working away from those receiving tongues at all times. There are occasions where we work backwards, but I'll show you those shortly when we get to some of the trickier bits like door frames. So we know where we're starting and we need an expansion gap around the edge, but we're not going to bring out the packers yet. There's no point at this stage. We are just setting out. So our first full plank can sit there in the doorway. I'll bring it out very slightly because I need to get past these radiator pipes. And then all I'm going to do, I'm not going to lock the planks in yet. I'm just going to lay them roughly where they're going to be so that I can get an idea of where they're all going to go. Now I'm going to do this all the way up to the end of the room there, whether that be a doorway or a wall that you're working into, it doesn't matter. You just need to work your way to the end of the room. Now a lot of people ask, what way should I lay my LVT? I like to work along the longest wall of the room, so the length of the plank is running along the length of the room. Now we've got to the last plank into the doorway or the wall, whatever your scenario, and we need to have a look at what the cut is going to be and check that it's not a tiny little piece. And you can see that that last cut is about 300mm long. Now that's okay, that's a nice big cut, but if it wasn't, what we'd have to do is cut a little bit off the end of that plank to bring the whole thing that way so that we had a bigger section at that end of the room. So we know we're good up that end of the room. We're doing a random stagger pattern today. It's the most professional finish that you'll be able to get as a DIY. It's going to look really good, and it's a recommended finish for most types of LVT or in fact laminate as well out there on the market. So I'll show you how to continue the random stagger pattern in a minute when we start laying the boards, but for now what we need to do is work out the width of the room so that we don't get a horrible little cut when we get to the other side. Now there's a lot of ways that you can work out your width, but as a DIY the easiest way for you to do it is grab a board, take into account your expansion gap and make a little mark on the floor at the width of the board. So we're just going to make a series of marks across the room at the width of our board, and that's going to tell us where the last board is going to finish. And that allows us to determine that we've got a big enough cut along our finishing row. Now if that wasn't the case, you'd have to rip down your first row along the starting wall to bring the whole thing over to give you a bigger gap along the finish wall. Now we can start laying some planks. So we'll come back to start in this left hand corner, remember with the receiving tongues facing away from both walls. These are 5mm spacers. This particular floor is a minimum of 4mm spacing around the edge. Remember, this is a floating floor. It needs to be able to move. So I've got 5mm spacers. They're going to be plenty for this floor. Now make sure you check your instructions for your particular floor because they all differ very slightly. So all I'm going to do is pop in a couple of 5mm spacers along that first row, and don't worry about your spacers too much at the moment because this first row, until we get some weight in this, about 3 rows in, it's all going to move. So these are going to fall out. We're going to have to keep putting them back. Don't worry too much at this stage. We can tidy all that up once we get a few rows in. It's always more difficult to start with because you're laying your floor like this. It's a lot easier once you can use your body weight, and I like to lay the floor kind of away from my body. So once we've got a few rows, we can sit on it, use our body weight, and it'll be a lot easier. So we'll start locking in our first panels now, and straight away we've got a radiator pipe to contend with. So I'll bring my second plank in, I'll just lock it in place, just like that, and then what I can do is mark the centre of my radiator pipe. So I can mark the centre of the pipe just there. Now I will take a measurement from a spacer to the centre of the pipe, 70mm. I'll mark 70mm from the edge of the plank. Make a little mark at 70mm. Now I'll just use a square to transfer that mark up to 70mm, and I know where my pipe needs to be. And all I'm going to do is where those 2 lines cross that we made, I'm just going to pop through a step drill bit. I'll go up to 18 or 20mm. All the handy little tools that you'll need will be in the video description, and I'm just going to pop a hole through, nice neat hole on that mark. Now I'm going to show you my little trade tip of how you make the cleanest cut around radiator pipes possible. Now I'll grab a sharp knife and a square, and I'm going to cut on that pencil line that we made earlier. Just going to score it with a sharp knife blade. Score that a few times, and then we're going to put a little bit of pressure on the cut, and that's going to snap. Now you can see the cut on the back of the plank there. I'm going to use my square at 45 degrees And what I'm going to do is just make a cut to the edge of that hole that we made. A very faint score on the back of the plank. We'll do that in both directions. And then if we turn it back over, we'll be able to just find that score and snap the plank back very slightly. You'll feel it snap, and we'll be able to get that in position. And you can see the nice clean job once we put those two flaps, if you like, back down. So that's how you cut perfectly neatly around radiator pipes. There are other little ways to do it on more flexible LVTs. Sometimes you can make that initial cut and then you can literally bend it around the pipe. So look, on the bright side, at least we got how to lay LVT around pipes out the way early. Right, let me show you how these planks click in place. Now on these ones, it's the lead and tongue there, the small tongue that clicks in to the receiving tongue. Now these ones, all you do is you fit them at an angle and you lay them down and they lock in place. They're nice and easy. This one's under a radiator, so it's a bit trickier, but we can still tilt it because of the flexibility. Tilt it down and it's gone in. Now that's locked in place. It's not going to go anywhere. We can continue moving in that direction. Make sure each plank that you lock in place is not tipped in any direction. Make sure that that gap is nice and even. So we've worked from that corner all the way up the room. We've cut around the rad. That's nice and tidy, and we've got back to that doorway. Those are all clicked in now, and what we need to do is cut that last piece into the doorway. Of course, if you're not going into a doorway, you might be going into a wall. Same thing, because we're not going around the frame on this plank. I'll show you that in a minute, but all we need to do is cut the length of this plank here. Now we've got a door bar going in this doorway, and it's going to sit about there. So what we want to do, you can see I've made a little mark there. That's where our floor is going to come up to. That is the length of this final plank. And of course we know that we want that lead and tongue there. That would go in there. So in this scenario, what we could just do is lock it in and make a mark, and we'd know where to cut. If you're going into a wall where you can't run through the doorway, like a lot of you will be, I'll show you a quick trick of how we measure for the cut that we need. So we know we need to keep the lead and tongue to go into that receiving tongue there, and normally we'd have a wall here, so we can't lay the plank in. We'd only be able to butt it up. So a quick way to get around that, spin the plank round, butt the end of the plank, the tongue that you want, up against the wall. So let's say we're going to butt it up just there, and then all we need to do, if we come down here, you can see our mark from earlier, we just mark in line with that plank, and that way we know the length to cut and we'll be able to keep the correct tongue. Now for straight cuts on planks, it's really easy. You don't need any special tools. All you need is a sharp knife and a square, and we'll just square off on that mark and make a little score line, a couple of scores across the top of the plank, and then once that plank is scored, we can just snap it, and there is our cut. And now that little piece is going to fit just perfectly. Now in a little while I'm going to show you backwards laying, I'm going to show you undercutting these door frames. This is the sort of area where it gets really tricky in between doorways, and we will need to backwards lay and do a few little trade tricks. But what we'll do now is continue looking at that random lay pattern, so we'll go back to that end and keep working our way across the room, and we'll come back to the tricky bit in a minute. So stick around for that, because that's the stuff you really don't want to miss. So the trick to random laying a LVT floor is to use the offcut from that end up there, and we're going to bring that down this end, and I'll show you how we create the random staggered pattern. So our offcut is going to go next. It's going to go just there. It's up to you how you create your staggered pattern. You can see we've got a joint there. I'll mark it just in case you can't see it, and we've got, of course, this plank here. But what we now want to do is create another smaller plank just down here. So I've worked out my third plank wants to be 260, and my fourth plank here I'm going to put at about 710. So now I've laid those in, you can see what we've got there to start with. We've got 4 different lengths so that none of the joints line up anywhere on the floor, and we can carry that pattern on row at a time until we get to the other end of the room, whether that be a wall or a doorway, and then we use the offcuts back over this end and we continue, and that is how we get the random staggered pattern. I'll show you how it works as we progress, but let's start clicking in the next row, because this next row is the one that lots of people find tricky. Now before I do that, please hit subscribe. It allows me to bring better content to the channel, and hit like if the video is helping you out, because it'll allow it to help more people. So let's get this next row in. Now this next plank is the one that people usually find really tricky, because you've got a lot of different things to work with. You've got 2 receiving tongues, you've got to get the whole thing in, and you've got to try and make sure that this previous plank doesn't come out, because that is quite common. So what I like to do, get your body weight, and it's easier when you've got a little bit of the floor down, but get your body weight on the previous plank, get this plank nice and close to the receiving tongue on the length of the plank, if you like. Keep your body weight on this plank as far back as you can. Hopefully you can see this. We're going to lock this one in as close as we possibly can to this one. You'll find that once you get that edge in, that leading tongue, you'll be able to wiggle the whole thing across, put a little bit of pressure up and down the plank, manoeuvre the plank into the previous row, and it will all click in together. And there you go, you can see the click system has locked in both of those tongues. That is now absolutely solid, it's not going to go anywhere. The trick is keeping your weight on this plank here and using your body to manoeuvre this plank into both tongues at once. Now we're just going to keep laying full planks along the length of the room in exactly the same way as we just did. Keep an eye on the joints as you go. You don't want any joints opening up or anything like that. If you do, take a bit of time, make sure you get the joints right. There's no rush, and keep working across the room, and I'll show you some of the trickier bits once we get there. So we've got a bunch of rows of planks in, but now we've come to one of the trickiest things of the whole job, and that is a door frame. Now, they don't have to be tricky, because there's an easy way to tackle them and get a pro finish. What we don't do is cut the floor around the frame. We cut the frame around the floor. So we're going to undercut the door liner here. Now the door stops have already been done, so we haven't got to worry about that. They've been cut in the past. But if your door stop goes all the way to the floor, you'll have to do that as well. And the same with your architraves. If you've left those on, you'll have to do those as well. Skirtings are off and architraves are off for this job, which does make it a little bit easier, and they're being replaced later. Gives it a pro finish. I prefer that than using a Scottier trim at the end. I always prefer to take the skirtings off and replace them after I've done the floor. It just gives you a much better finish. Now to get this plank in, that means that we're going to have to lay this plank first and backwards lay this row that way, rather than working towards the door and laying the door last. That doesn't work. You can't put this piece in last because of the direction. So this piece has to go in first, and then we backwards lay. So to undercut our door liner, we've got the piece of floor in there. What we're going to do is line that up with where we want it, and then all we're going to do is strike a pencil line just above that piece of flooring. And by having that line a little higher than the flooring, that means the flooring can still manoeuvre, because we need to maintain the expansion gap even under the frame. Now I'm going to use a multi-tool and I'm going to undercut the frame. I'm just running that multi-tool blade along the line that I scribed onto the door frame. Now a small chisel just to remove that piece of timber. So we've undercut the frame, but we still need to make a couple of marks on the flooring and make a couple of small cuts just to give it that expansion gap and allow it to drop in place. So I'm going to lock my flooring in, bring it up to the frame, and I want to go into the frame by about 5 mil. So I've made a mark on that piece of flooring by about 5 mil. That'll give me an expansion gap between the piece of timber under the frame and the flooring. Now I'll line that piece of flooring up with the frame in this direction, and I'll do the same there. I'll mark that about 5 mil past there. And now I can essentially just scribe a mark from point to point, and I know that's the bit I need to remove. Now we know that for our straight cuts across the plank, we're using a knife. That's all we need to snap LVT in half. But for those more intricate cuts, a jigsaw with what I call a laminate flooring blade. It's just a thin blade. Now these are very easy to use. You don't need to apply much pressure at all, just let the blade do the work. Now you need your piece of flooring, an off-cut of flooring to lock into it, and a rubber mallet. So we'll get that piece of flooring as close as we can and click it in to the previous bit of flooring. Then we'll get our off-cut and we'll just roughly click that in to the end of that piece of flooring. This piece of flooring stops us damaging that tongue because we need that tongue. Use our rubber mallet just to slide that plank in position. And you'll have noticed I don't use many power tools throughout this whole job, just the multi-tool and the jigsaw really. Now don't tell everyone, actually maybe you could, but we give away tools like this, the tools from the biggest brands on my website, Ultimate Tool Competitions. And this week we've got something really special for you, the Makita 18 volt 5-piece power tool kit. With 5 top of the range Makita power tools in it, including the impact driver, the combi drill, circular saw, multi-tool and blower. This kit is nearly 700 quid's worth, but you could win it for just £1 a ticket. So whether you're a tradesman or a DIYer, this is the tool kit for you. If you don't want the tools though, we are giving away a £600 cash alternative to the tools. And our mission is simple, to give away as many tools as we can every single week. Low odds, low prices, as many winners as possible. Right, so let's backwards lay this floor. There's nothing technical about this, it is just what we did before in reverse order. But remember guys, if you want power tools, check out Ultimate Tool Competitions for me. The link will be down below in the description. Just like before, tilt the panel, bring it in close to the previous row, give it a bit of pressure and it'll pop in. Now using some of the techniques that you've just learned, all you've got to do is work your way across the room, going around any obstacles until you get to the very last row. With staircases, if you're going into the bottom of stairs, you haven't got to worry about this edge here. Just bring it in with your 5mm gap and your carpet will come down over the top of it. As long as you're just about in line with that gripper, all you have got to do is undercut your newel post and stringer so that it looks nice around the stringer and newel. Other than that, just bring it up nice and flush. So I've worked my way across the room. You can see it's looking pretty good now. We've got that one last plank to go in there. We've got to rip that down. I'll show you how to do that without a circular saw. And you can see I've undercut there. I have undercut in the door frame. I've undercut over in the bathroom. And all we've got to do now, undercut that door here. Of course, there'll be a plank going through into the doorway that'll finish against the door because we've got to put a door bar in there. I'm going to show you that process as well. We'll include that in this video. Now with our last plank with LVT, we don't need a circular saw to rip that down. We can do that nice and easy without any fancy tools. So let's do this last little bit now and then we'll move on to the door bar and any finishing touches. Now for that final row of flooring on the finishing side of the room. All we need to do is take the plank that we want to install, line the edge up with our previous row, take an offcut of flooring and we'll run that along the wall with a pencil hard against it, which will scribe a mark and in turn the shape that we need onto the plank that we're installing. I'm going to use my knife just like we normally do and I'm going to just run that along the bottom of that level a couple of times. We can just run our thumb down there. You can see they're starting to snap. There we go. And that is the piece that we want. Now to install that last row of LVT, because we're hard against the wall, it can be a little bit tricky. You can get things called pull bars, but for LVT, I never really use them. The way I approach this is to tip the floor up at a pretty aggressive angle and then pull it with my fingertips into the previous row. Now you can see behind me I've started refitting my new skirting boards and architraves. You don't have to take off skirtings and architraves to do this, but it does give you a better finish. You can just use Scotia trims if you prefer to go up to the skirting boards. You can put the little trims around that'll hide it. So that only really leaves us one more step to make a nice finish of this new floor. And of course that's door bars, where 2 floors meet between each room. Now there's lots of different transitions and door bars. Have a look on the instructions what your specific floor needs for the transitions. Some will have different ones if they've got carpet or LVT in the other room, for example. But I'll show you the generic way to cut one to transition between 2 hard floors. Our door bar should sit underneath the door, this side of the doorstop. So what we're going to do is take a quick measurement. I'll transfer that measurement onto my door bar. I'll then use a mitre block and hacksaw to make a nice straight cut. Now good quality door bars come with a couple of options. You've got these mechanical fixings, you drill down into the floor, slide these into the rail and push them down into the holes and they clip in. The only trouble with that is if you've got pipes under the floor, like I know there are here, you don't want to be using these, so be careful. If you are using the adhesive, just be very careful that you don't have any dust or dirt on the floor, because that will impede the stickiness of those adhesive strips on the back. Providing the floor is nice and clean, this stuff is really strong and it won't come off. Well, at the start of the video, I promised you a pro finish, so let's take a look. You be the judge. Now, hopefully, by following this guide, you can see that you can overcome some of the toughest obstacles, and that getting that pro finish is plenty achievable without paying someone to do it. I hope it's helped. If it has, hit one of these because they're bound to help you as well, and I'll see you guys in the next one.